Time of trouble. The climate cooled, and folk, I have said this 50 times this semester. The Black Death was largely caused by a cooling of the climate. When the climate is warm, things are really good for mankind. When the climate is cool, and if this is not politically correct, I'm sorry. If you haven't guessed already, I dislike political correctness. But the climate cooled. Summers got shorter, which meant that a lot of crops that they used to could grow would no longer grow. The frost came later. I mean, most of you are probably not farmers or never hung around a farm. But the first frost came later in the spring, and the first frost in this fall came earlier, and a lot of crops were killed by frost before harvest time. There were heavy storms and constant rains. Starvation and hunger resulted. Famine came. And shortly after, because of the famine, people's bodies might have been less resistant to infection. It was the first major plague to strike Europe in 700 years. In other words, previous to this, the 700 years previous, Europe had a warm climate. And all of a sudden, the climate cooled down. And folk, I think these things go in natural cycles, and that we humans have absolutely no control over. I mean, does anybody have any idea how we could heat the sun up if it cools down a little bit? We used to think the sun's output was constant. Now we realize the sun's output varies. If you don't have any idea, I don't either. I mean, it can't be done. We're trying to cool the sun down if it gets a little bit too hot. We do know that the Black Death's history, it might have started in Mongolia. And when Genghis Khan came over across the mountains with the Mongolians, rats followed his camps. Of course, these people probably didn't see them much, but the rats followed, and the rats carried the Black Death germ. The Genoese merchants brought the disease to Sicily, and then from Sicily it spread all over Europe and killed a third of Europe's population. Sometimes it wiped out whole villages, many of which never recovered. Now, not only did Europe's population go way down in the 1300s, about the time Europe started to recover in the late 1600s, another little ice age occurred, and Europe's population declined again. In the mid-1700s, so around 1750, well, the smallpox vaccination was invented, but the climate warmed also, and the bubonic plague, of which the Black Death was a part, dissipated. The Black Death was part of the bubonic plague. Now, I want to throw in a few little interesting side notes about the Black Death. Little kids at recess time, I don't know what they're doing, but they used to gather around and sing a song. They'd hold hands, ring around the roses, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. This song came from Black Death when they believed that if they put flowers in their pockets, it would ward off the Black Death, or at least make them smell better. A lot of times the dead would lie in a house unburied because nobody wanted to go in and bury the dead. It just created a really, really bad smell, bad stench. And a church which had done so well during the Roman plagues as far as helping the sick, in this case, the church simply, even the priest, would abandon the sick, and which guaranteed the person who was infected would die. And the result was it led to a decline in respect for the church, which I'll have more to say about later. Now, in addition, it made people hate two classes of people, Jews and old maids. Now, old maids did not tend to get the plague as much as other people. And does anybody have any idea why? I mean, what do old maids tend to have around their dwelling places? Cats. Excellent. What good did the cats do? The cats kept down the number of rats that carried the disease in the first place. Now maybe mixed up on which rat, but it's believed that the black rat carried the plague, and the Pepsis virus that lived on the flea that carried the plague only lived on the black rat. Eventually, it's known the brown rat came into Europe, and the brown rat drove out the black rat. If any of you have studied parasitology, and I took a course in it one time, these parasites sometimes can only live on one type of host and not another. They can live on one color of rat and not live on another. But eventually the brown rat came in and drove out the black rat, which helped the plague to decline. But in the case of Jews, it's believed that they got the plague less because of Jews' emphasis on cleanliness. Old maids, they began to associate Jews and old maids together and associate both of them with witchcraft. Old maids were accused of using witchcraft to keep the plague away from them, when in actuality it was probably their cats that did them more good than anything else. Their cats kept the rats away. The peasants took advantage of this situation because the nobility seemed weaker, and a lot of peasant uprisings occurred. The nobles felt really threatened and finally crushed the peasants. In northern France, the peasants would kill a lot of nobles and knights, and here's something that what this was to lead to was eventually the nobles realized they had to give the commoners more rights. One thing that helped the peasants out was the peasants got hold of firearms or guns. The gun was invented or brought into Europe about this time, and a serf with a gun could kill a lord. And this did a lot to weaken the power of the lords. And in fact, it also weakened the knights because these bullets could penetrate the knight's armor. And knights in armor eventually became less dominant on the battlefield. We're going to talk more about this later in the lesson. In England, there was a peasant rebellion that actually marched on London, and Richard was the second, not Richard the first, but he promised the rebels that, hey, we'll give in to you if you just disperse. The rebels went home. Richard II backed out of his promise and punished the rebels. But there was some good that came out of the Black Death. Wages went up because there was a scarcity of workers. Some kings stepped in to try to keep the poor people poor. But wages then were kept a little bit lower than they might have been. Prices were controlled. Nevertheless, more serfs were able to buy their freedom. Towns sprang up. The nobility still had a hard time finding laborers. All this led to... for those of you who just walked in, you can notice this on the... All right. Now, what set off the 100 Years' War was England, and the kings of England had long held lands owned by the kings of France. I mentioned how that King Henry married Eleanor, the Duchess of Aquitaine, and therefore the kings of England became heirs to large territories in France. Even though the kings of England did not think of themselves inferior to the kings of France, but nevertheless the king of England was a vassal. Well, the king of France was interfering in the affairs of the duchy that belonged to the king of England. And then came the case of Philip the Fair. Now, I mentioned how that Philip the Fair was the king who rounded up all the Templars he could get and killed them all. Well, it's been said that the Grand Vizier of the Knights Templar said to the king, Philip, meet me around the throne of God. And after that, both the king and the pope were dead within the same year. Again, if you look on the chart, you'll find that King Philip died the same year that the pope did. But also it was said that the vizier cursed the king of France and said, your descendants will not sit on your throne. Well, King Philip the Fair had 3 sons. And these 3 sons ruled for 18 years, one after the other. The first one for about 6 years, the second for about 6 years, the third for about 6 years, and none of them had any children. The third one had a child on the way when he died, so they waited to see whether the baby would be a boy or a girl. If the baby would be a girl, there wouldn't be a queen. If the baby would be a boy, he'd be anointed king. Well, the baby was born stillborn, so King Philip had no grandsons. Well, at this time, the King of England said, hey, I'm related to the King of France. The throne should go to me. The French said no. They picked their own man, someone who was closely related to the royal line, but not the King of England, Edward III. So Edward III sent his army into France to try to get the throne. And what followed is a war known as the 100 Years' War, because it lasted about 100 years. Things changed during the 100 Years' War. For one thing, gunpowder was used. So knights in armor were to play less of a role. Gunpowder with a hand-heavy cannon. There was no armor could stand up to a big cannonball coming at it. The cannonball, even the gun, the rifle. The pikeman, it was found that you got a team of men together with pikes. I mean, the pike is a glorified term for spear, except the spears were thrown, pikes were heavier, they were not thrown. But the pikeman, lining shoulder to shoulder with other pikemen, could even bring down an armored knight, because they could thrust the pike with such force that it would even penetrate a knight's shield and armor. The pikeman became important, and also the bowman. Somebody developed a long bow. The long bow was about 6 foot long, and it could penetrate an armor, a knight's armor. And the crossbow, if any of you know anything about bow and archery, the crossbow can get a shot off that would have a whole lot of power. I mean, the crossbow is, the bow is bent by a lever, not by a person's hand. It's bent by a lever. And that way it's very, very powerful. It has a very powerful thrust. The arrow has. So the pikeman and bowman played bigger roles. In other words, the armored knight was to play less of a role, and your ordinary low-born soldier was to play a bigger role. Now, there were two battles, big battles in a war. The Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Agincourt, and both of them were a lot alike. In both cases, a rainstorm came up, and the rain played a big part in the outcome of the battle. But anyway, the French knights went into battle with no planning, no formation. They just simply galloped into battle on their horses, and were met with a hail of arrows. The horses and knights slipped in the mud, and it was said that once a knight had fallen, it took maybe 5 men to pick him back up with his heavy armor. And a lot of these knights suffocated inside their armor. They fell off the horse and could not breathe while on the ground. And most of the knights who died smothered inside their armor. It was an English victory. Again, I've seen some artists do a picture of it. They showed a picture of these French knights galloping into battle, and they were met by some English longbowmen who shot arrow after arrow at them, and the arrows, again, these arrows were effective because they had a whole lot of thrust to them, and they could even penetrate a knight's shield and armor. All right. Now, we're going to jump, though, ahead of the war. I mean, it took them 100 years to fight. We're going to jump to near the end of the war. Joan of Arc. There were several periods of little fighting. But the war resumed when Charles VI died. Now here's a story about Charles VI. Well, Charles VI started off young man, young king, and one day he was leading his army, and some insane man got close to him, and Charles VI himself went insane. Now, folk, I can't explain it, but just you can do the research yourself. Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad. Well, now, he willed his crown to the King of England years before he had any sons, and therefore the fighting ended. But here's the problem with wills, folks. The problem with wills is, what is the mental condition of the person who makes out the will? Well, Charles VI is known to be in and out of insanity. I mean, for the last 30 years of his life, he was sane part of the time and insane part of the time, then becomes sane again and insane. His sanity was questioned, his mental capacities were questioned. And when he died, the people of France would not make the King of England king. Instead, during 10 years into his insanity, a son was born to Charles VI, known as Charles VII. All right. And when the crown was not given to the King of England sent his army into France. Charles VII, though, was picked by the French to be their king. But Charles VII did not know if he was really the rightful ruler or not. And here was his problem. There was a rumor going around that Charles VI was impotent. And of course, any of you know anything about impotence in men, it can be intermittent. It can come and go. And there was a rumor that the Queen, the mother of Charles, the wife of Charles VI, and the mother of Charles VII, had an affair, and therefore Charles VII really was not the true son of Charles VI. Someday we might dig up their bodies and determine was Charles VII, use DNA to determine was Charles VII really the son of Charles VI or not, but the fact is he didn't know, we don't know. Charles VII was very indecisive, unsure if he was the rightful ruler, and during his earlier reign there was an air of pessimism among the French because it looked like the English were going to win, and Charles VII did not have the confidence in his people that he could lead. The rumor went around at one time he'd gone around the palace in a patched robe, and for the king to go in a patched robe, this just was a scandal that spread all over France. The king is impoverished, the king can't make up his mind about anything, the king can't come to firm decisions. And it looked like he had little chance to win the war. And most of the French nobility either sided with the English or didn't know which side they were on. All right, into this scenario stepped young Joanne. When Joan of Arc was about 10 years old, she began praying, "Oh Lord, save France." Well, she then began to believe she heard voices, and those, anyone wants to go into detail, the voices came from St. Michael, St. Margaret, and St. Catherine. The Margaret and Catherine were obscure saints that we don't think about anymore, but saints from way back, many generations before. But these voices told her to go lead an army and deliver France. Well, she went to the local nobleman in her village, Sir Robert Beaumains. Now, folks, persons who have researched the issue say it was not uncommon for young teenage girls to go to the nobleman to discuss their problems, to discuss issues. So her going to the nobleman's court was probably not unusual. And it's also been proven that a lot of women volunteered for the army in those days. If she had just simply gone in and volunteered to join the army, she might have been allowed to join, because and some women actually served with this distinction. However, she went to Sir Robert's court and said, "Sir Robert, I want you to take me to the king. I believe I can deliver the people from the English." She was laughed out of the king's court. Her father gave her a sound whipping, and for a while Joanne never heard from visions, from voices, but eventually her voices came back. Now, folks, I'm not going to try to explain what the problem was with Joanne. I mean, I read recently that she was suffering from epilepsy, and the article was about epileptics, and how many famous people have been epileptic. Among them, Alexander the Great. Among them, Julius Caesar, and Joan of Arc, and Socrates. I mean, they use evidence. Socrates came to talk to a demon as evidence that he suffered from hallucinations. Be that as it may, I'm not going to attempt to explain. I'm just going to give the story to you the way they told it and let you figure it out yourself. Anyway, she eventually, and folks, we do not know how she did this, but she eventually got Sir Robert to take her seriously. Sir Robert did not go himself, but he sent some of his crack troops to the king to accompany Joanne. They traveled at night, and they hid in the daytime to escape the English. And if you visit France today, in the village, near the village of Douarnenez, there are a lot of French who are proud to tell you that my ancestors hid Joan of Arc while she was going to the king, or Joan of Arc stayed with us one day. She was to stay one place a day and travel out. Stayed with us one day, and we hear from the English armies. The English got word that she was coming, and they began to look for her. They didn't find her. Eventually, she got to the palace of the king, and one of the guards at the gate made fun of her. She said, "Watch what you're saying, for your death is near." Within an hour, that guard was dead. I mean, again, folk, I'm not going to try to explain what happened. Well, they began to prepare her to go into the king, and the king, who was, whatever else he was an intelligent man. The king looked around the room and found a lackey who was about his size. He said, lackey, hey, you step over me to an adjacent room. And the king and lackey exchanged clothes. When it came out, the lackey was dressed in the king's royal robes with a crown on his head, and the lackey sat on a throne impersonating the king. And the king had lackey clothes on, and he stood in the corner with a tray, like he was a servant. They were going to make a dunce out of Joan of Arc. Well, Joanne came into the room, having supposedly never seen the king. She ignored the lackey who was impersonating the king, and went right up to the king, who was dressed in lackey clothes, and bowed down and did obeisance and called him Dauphin. Now, the word Dauphin in French means heir apparent. Joanne refused to call him king because he had not yet been crowned. The people of France who saw it, and folks, this was the most educated people living in Europe at the time. All they could do was applaud, because she had not been fooled by the king's little joke. She had recognized the king for who he was. Well, the king all of a sudden found that he had an army. I mean, the city of Orleans was being besieged, and the king could do nothing about it. But then, thanks to Joanne, all of a sudden volunteers from all over France began pouring into the king's army. What Joanne supplied was what was needed. She supplied a feeling of patriotism, a spirit of fighting spirit. Nationalism might be another word. The pride of being French. All of a sudden, the French people began to take pride. In fact, hey, we're French. We don't have to put up with this in the English. And volunteers began to pour into the king's army from all over the realm and even outside. Then the king had to decide, should I give this army to this young girl or not? That was a tough decision for a man who had to make a decision. He tried to ask this bishop what to do, and this bishop examined Joanne to determine whether or not she was a virgin, and finally decided, yes, if she was a virgin, she probably was not a witch, according to the mores of that time. The big issue was she a witch or was she a saint? Was she a prophet sent from God, or was she merely a witch sent from the devil? Well, after several weeks of indecisive trying to pawn off the decision to someone else, and everybody would give it back to the king, saying, you're the king, you make the decision. The king finally gave her the leadership of the army. Make a long story short, she won 4 battles. After that, the king felt proud. He felt quite proud, yes, but the king felt confident enough to have himself crowned. Only then would Joanne call him king. Then she decided, all right, Your Majesty, let's go take on Paris. The king and his generals said, oh no, we're not ready to take on Paris yet. Oh no, let's go take on Paris. And here's where Joanne made her biggest mistake. The 4 battles she won were militarily sound strategies. To take on Paris, no, the king wasn't ready for that yet, because the English had too firm control. Nevertheless, she went. Her word prevailed over the king. She went. She was captured, turned over to the English. The English tried her for witchcraft. Again, I've read detailed accounts of it. I don't have time to go into detail here. Eventually, in 1431, she was burned at the stake for the crime of witchcraft, but no sooner had they done so than the English decided, hey, we have got to burn the saint. Well, her father died 2 years later, broken heart. The king gave her mother the title of nobility, and we exempted her family from taxes for 300 years. The mother lived for a good many years afterward. The king himself lived to be an old man. 20 years after she died, the mother wrote a letter to the king and said to the king, can you petition the Pope to have Joanne's case retried? If you know anything about popes, popes usually lasted 2 or 3 years, sometimes 4 or 5. Well, the king sent a message to the Pope to look into Joanne's case. The problem was some of the bishops who had convicted Joanne were still alive. So what the Pope did, he overturned all the convictions made against Joanne from the clerics who were still alive, from the clerics who were deceased. So some of the charges against Joanne still stood. Well, a couple of years later, that Pope died, a new Pope took over. By this time, all the clerics who had convicted Joanne were deceased. The king sent another letter to the Pope. The new Pope cleared Joanne of all charges and restored her to the church. Now, jump fast forward to 1920. World War I had ended, and the Catholic Church felt it must do something to unify Europe. So, to help try to unify Europe and heal the wounds of war, she was declared a saint in 1920. She's now called Saint Joan of Arc. And as all saints do, she has a day. Her day is May 30th. None of you are old enough to remember. May 30th used to be Memorial Day. President Nixon changed it to the last Monday in May. The day used to be May 30th. May 30th is her day. Well, now, she was convicted and burned at the stake in 1431. By 1438, the king had almost all of France. Here's how he did it. He'd pick his fights. Whatever else you can say about the king, he was wise and all that. He'd pick his fights, win a fight and get a duke on his side. Then he'd win another fight and get another duke on his side. Win another fight. By 1438, he had the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Lorraine on his side. Don't worry about the names so much, but the Duke of Burgundy and Duke of Lorraine were, during that generation, the two most powerful dukes in all of France. When he had them on his side, the English might as well have gone home. And in 1453, the war ended. It had lasted 100 years. The old social order began to weaken. Now, the peasants' revolts, folk, are very important because where these eventually led to was Europe became more democratic and the old order was slowly broke down. Now, the old order where the nobles controlled Europe was not to completely end until World War I. But the power of nobility kept getting weaker and weaker and weaker throughout the 1500s, 16, 17, and 1800s. And finally, thanks to World War I, eventually the Royal House of Germany came to an end, the Royal House of Russia came to an end, and the Royal House of Austria came to an end. 3 royal houses and a whole lot of noble families came to an end also. Spain still has a lot of its nobility. England has its nobility, but they have no power. Some of these descendants of the old noble lines try to keep the titles going, but for the most part, there's no privilege left in much of Europe anymore. Kings, the power of the kings went up and down. Kings became weaker, then stronger. Eventually, though, kings were able to build up their power at the end of the nobles. The Byzantine Empire, the Fourth Crusade irreparably damaged it. And eventually, now 1453, of all the years, this year used to be called, folks, the dividing line between medieval and modern history. 2 events happened in 1453. 2 big events. They were, the 100 Years' War ended and Constantinople fell. The Byzantine Empire fell. So these were 2 big events that happened in 1453. Eventually the empire had been reduced in size. Now, when I was in high school, I read a book about the fall of Constantinople. Basically what happened was Mehmed II came with an army of 100,000 men, and all Constantinople had was some 5,000 men. The Byzantine emperor, who ironically was named Constantine XI, he appealed to Europe for aid, but only the Genoese came out. When the Genoese captain got wounded, the Genoese left. So the Byzantine Empire came to an end. All right. Italy divided into several states, among them Genoa, Venice, Naples, Lombardy, the Papal States. I didn't mention Sicily here. The boundaries of these states changed often. They were often at war with each other. And in fact, Italy and Germany were destined to remain disunited until 1870. And I, from time to time, read accounts of how this state, this state of Florence went to war with the Papal States, or the King of France would come in sometimes, so the Holy Roman Emperor would come in and try to straighten things out in Italy. Nothing straightened them out. They would remain disunited until some Italians decided to join them. themselves together. All right, the popes. I mentioned last time how the popes had enjoyed control of Western Christendom for a few generations. But then, Boniface VIII engaged in a fight with the King of France. The King of France said, I'm not going to be intimidated. I'm not going to put up with him anymore. Fury on him. I'm going to take charge. He went after Boniface. Boniface was able to escape him and run off, but he died of a broken heart, died in a state of utter confusion and disillusionment. And at this point, the papacy declined. Now, another thing I mentioned, I heard the church was during the bubonic plague with the Black Death, the church would hide itself and would not pay any attention to the sick or the who need them. That hurt the church also. But the King of France moved. Philip IV also, again, Philip the Fair, moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon. Avignon is located in southern France, and for 70 years, the popes made their home in Avignon. This has been called the Babylonian captivity. If you know anything about the history of the Jews, the Babylonian captivity was destined to last 70 years, or foretold by the prophet Jeremiah to last 70 years. While in Avignon, all the popes and all the cardinals, or most of the cardinals, were French. The cardinals, bishops, and archbishops were almost all French. This went on for 70 years. And finally, at the end of 70 years, they elected a new pope. And the new pope said, I'm not going to stay here in France. I'm moving back to Rome. Well, another party came on the scene, and they elected a pope who said that I'll stay at Avignon. Well, the church now had two popes. Now, it was to get worse than that. One pope was at Avignon, the other pope was at Rome, and these two popes excommunicated each other, and each wrote anathemas to each other. Well, somebody got the idea of, hey, what we got to do, we got to resolve this. We can't have two popes. There's only one pope. So they got together, and they elected another pope. The problem was the first two popes would not retire. So the church now had three popes. Now, this actually happened, folks. Now, this made news in 2013 because eventually all three of these popes resigned, and we were not to have any other pope resign until the year 2013. So for 600 years, no pope ever resigned. But this made news. All right, we had three popes. Well, finally, the princes of Europe got together, and now this is important. They said to the church, you meet in a council, and you appoint your own pope. And we promise we'll recognize as pope the person you appoint. And again, the kings at this point were not allowed to appoint a pope. It's like the church should appoint its own popes. And again, well, I can't emphasize how important this was. This, to me, is one of the things that made Europe eventually so great. The church became separate from the state. The church got together in a council, and they deposed the other three popes, and this time the three popes did retire because all of Europe's princes agreed to recognize the man who this council appointed. His name was Martin V. If you look at a picture of Martin V, he was a very, very heavyweight man. He lasted 5 years. Well, Martin V, one of his first acts as pope was to make the three men who had been deposed cardinals, or the three men who agreed to resign. He made them cardinals. And but in the case of all four popes, the other three, they all died shortly thereafter. I mean, this was a time period when death was at a person's door any time in his life, whether he's in his teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s. But the new pope operated from Rome. The papal schism had become a big scandal in Europe, but it greatly damaged the church and greatly damaged the authority of the papacy. And it was where this was to lead, it was set up for the Protestant Reformation. It was to come in the early 1500s. It was set up for men like Martin Luther. This was in the 1300s, about 100 years after the papal schism ended. Martin Luther was born. Actually, it's more like 150 years. About 150 or so years after the papal schism ended, Martin Luther was born. And but the damage to the church had been permanent. All right. Now we have about 30 minutes. I want to spend some of that time, or the rest of this time, reviewing, but just to kind of catch up real quickly on attendance. Vanessa came in. Megan Watkins, sorry. All right. Leaving this now. All right. What is the first Western civilization that we know anything about, that got civilization started throughout the Western world, possibly, probably the whole world? Who were the first civilized people we know anything about? Very important, folks. They were destined to disappear from history for 2,000 years, and remember who we are again. They were the Sumerians, the Sumerians. Yeah, like the Mohenjo-Daro, they were destined to disappear from history, be forgotten about for 2,000 years. The Sumerians. And it's said that all of mankind's religions might be able to be traced to the Sumerians. They domesticated the cat, the dog, the sheep, the pig, the camel, the ox, invented the wheel, set up the office of king, set up schools, wrote their records on clay tablets, and folk, I have heard that, I read just the other night, that many of those clay tablets have never been translated. You might have heard of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in 1948, and for some 40 years afterward, most of them were not allowed to be translated. Finally, so we just got tired and said, hey, we're going to translate them anyway, give them to us, and the Israeli government agreed to let them have it, because people don't want to know what some of these documents actually say. So they try to hide them. But a lot of the Sumerian documents have not been translated, I've heard. All right. Which of these Babylonian kings is remembered for his law code? King? Who?
It starts with an H.
Yeah, it starts with an A. That's an excellent point. If you see that on a multiple choice test, it's probably the only choice we get. It starts with an H. King Hammurabi. Think of Cunningham. Hammurabi. Hammurabi, remembered for his famous law code. Now later we can run into another king who, for his law code, it was used throughout Europe. King Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, who made a law code that was used throughout Europe. Hammurabi. All right. Who was the Roman ruler who ended the Republic? He took over as dictator and ended the Roman Republic. You're close, really close, but before him, the one before him, Julius Caesar ended the Roman Republic. Who is the Pope who made the calendar that we still use today? Pope is the calendar we use. It's very important to us. Before that, we used the Julian calendar, named after Julius Caesar. But this is the calendar we're using today is the Gregorian calendar, after Pope Gregory the Great. Pope Gregory. All right. Let's see. Egypt is located along what river? Always has been and still is. What river? The Nile, the River Nile. The title that Egyptian kings used throughout much of their history. Pharaoh. Well, I don't have a copy of the test in front of me. So I'm asking a bunch of questions. No, I'm not reading from the test. That answers the question. Because often, I mean, I made out 130 questions and you'll get 60 on the other guys. I don't know what 60 you'll get. I can't, my memory is not that good at me. So I'm not reading off the test. Who was the Israeli lawgiver? Who gave Israel its law? Moses. Very popular among blacks during the slave period because of the fact that Moses was the one who freed the Jewish slaves. The black people, the slaves' favorite biblical character was Moses. ISIS, making a lot of news in the modern world. ISIS was once a goddess of which country? Egypt. Then the Greeks and Romans took up for the worship of her, and some people believe that ISIS is still worshipped by secret societies to this day. Who are seagoing people who traveled all over the Mediterranean and taught the Greeks the alphabet? These people were the Phoenicians. And from them we get our word phonics. The alphabet that we use today has its origins, believed to have its origins with the Phoenicians. Who was the Persian king who allowed all conquered peoples, including the Jews, to return back to their homeland? Persian king allowed all the Jews to return to their homeland. King Cyrus. The Babylonian king who had captured the Jews and carried them away from their homeland, this Babylonian king's name was, anybody very important? It starts with an N. That's a good start. And then on a multiple choice test, starts with an N. Nebuchadnezzar. Now, a lot of times you remember the beginning of a lot of and I mean, I often do if a teacher said that how he got on his essay test, somebody would write something like this, and him and followed by a bunch of scribbling, and they'd hope that he'd count it right. No, he said, well, but if you know what the letter starts with, you have a good chance anyway. The question was, Nebuchadnezzar was the one who captured the Jews and carried them captive to Babylon. And I made reference to this because the Babylonian captivity of the in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. Who was the Persian religious teacher who taught the Persians, among other things, to speak the truth? Zoroaster. Excellent. Zoroaster. Now, the first civilization we know about in India is called the Harappan. Again, you should remember that because your paper that I signed was about that. And speaking of papers, at least one of you listening to me has not turned in any paper at all. Yeah, I'd like to see one. Check on iCollege, make sure I have them. And make sure you have a grade. All right. After the Harappans declined, or maybe they sent the Harappans and declined, there came another group of people who took over India. The same group that Hitler admired so well. The Aryans. Yeah, the Aryans. The same group that Hitler admired so much. The sacred writings of India is known as the And the Sanskrit's the language they use. Vedas, the Vedas. It's spelled Vedas, but someone corrected me on that one time. It's called Vedas. All right. What group of people is credited with inventing steel, silk, porcelain, the wheelbarrow, the printing press, gunpowder? Chinese. Made a lot of inventions that carried them pretty far. They're credited with inventing the rotor paper. The belief that man is basically evil and government must quelch man's evil urges and evil intentions is called, among other things, the belief that it's been practiced by various groups down through the ages, but what people is associated with most, called legalism. Legalism. Man is basically evil. Governments are set up to quelch man's evil. Legalism. The Greek philosopher who said, "Do as I say, but don't do as I do." Plato, Greek philosopher. Two Greek poems that describe a lot of what might, or at least what the Greek mindset was during Greek's Dark Age. Two poems that came out of the Greek's Dark Age. The Iliad and Odyssey, written by Homer, written by the blind poet Homer. Which Greek city-state was transformed into one big military camp? Sparta. That eventually became extinct. Sparta. All right. Why do we run a race today called the marathon? We run a race in every Olympic or every international sporting event called the marathon. Why do we do that? What? Because of a man in Greek time who ran that distance after a battle and dropped down in the middle of Athens dead. Thucydides. The battle was a battle of Marathon. The distance between Marathon and Athens is about 26 miles. The Greek gods were said to live where? Mount Olympus. Who is the chief of the Greek gods? Who is the Greek god of war? Yeah, the Romans called him Mars. That's right. The Greeks called him Ares. Ares. The Greek and Romans worshiped the same gods with different names. Who is said to be the father of history? The Greek writer of history is said to be the father of history. It begins with an H. That's excellent. I mean, that's who you're on the right path. Herodotus. Herodotus. Now, I don't emphasize literature a lot, but in the case of Greek literature, I've studied a little bit. What famous Greek play where a man killed his father and married his mother because fate had willed it? What play am I talking about? The story of... Any of you study in literature classes? Well, it was at least. Study of Oedipus. Oedipus. Fate had willed that he was going to kill his father and marry his mother, and his father kicked him out of the palace. He grew up without knowing that the king was his father. He wound up killing his father and marrying the queen, who turned out to be his mother. Because fate had willed it. What Athenian philosopher was eventually executed because he offended the Athenians? Socrates. In Greek times, if a person wanted to know the will of the gods, I mean, he could offer sacrifices. He could open up an animal, like all of the ancient peoples, open up an animal and look at its entrails. But to get a message direct from the gods, he would go to a place where he believed the god dwelt. This was called an oracle. An oracle. There was one at Delphi and one in the deserts of Egypt. The famous Macedonian ruler who led the Macedonians to conquer the Persian Empire and conquer all the way to India. Who is the Macedonian ruler who conquered all the way to India? Alexander the Great. And it is said in Persia, you will find that every Persian is an expert on Alexander the Great. Not every Persian, or not a Persian. Every Macedonian is an expert on Alexander the Great. Not the Persians. I mean, they'd want to forget him. Yes. Eventually, the Persian Empire was to recover and take on Rome and help destroy the Roman Empire before they were destroyed themselves. What city is called the City of Seven Hills? Rome. It's also known as the Eternal City. City of Seven Hills, Eternal City. To get control of North Africa, Rome had to defeat a certain city, and it took 3 wars over a series of 100 years. These wars are known as the Punic Wars, and the city they conquered was known as Carthage. Carthage, the Punic Wars. All right. What 2 famous Roman brothers urged the Roman Senate to take the lands that the rich were not using and redistribute these lands among the poor? These 2 brothers' names were Gracchus. I think that is Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Redistribution of wealth. Which Roman emperor is known for being one of the worst emperor Rome ever had, and he finally killed himself when he saw the people were against him? What emperor am I talking about? Nero. Nero. While Rome was at its height, on the other side of Eurasia was China, of course. And China, during the time that Rome was at its height, was ruled for 400 years by a dynasty known as the Han, the Han dynasty. Ruled for 400 years, the Han dynasty. And Rome and China fell about the same time, except China did not completely fall, Rome did. Who was the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire? Constantine. And weirdly enough, the last Byzantine emperor was named Constantine also. The American Indians are said to have come from what part of the world? Siberia, Mongolia. And folk, I just read something recently, since the lesson, that Genghis Khan actually was instrumental in making a lot of Mongolians flee. Mongolians who did not want to submit to his rule, and a lot of Mongolians fled to the Americas. Believe that if you will. But they did not flee through Siberia, they got on board ships. And if that weren't enough, it's said that a lot of European peoples, a lot of Indian place names are the same as place names you'll find in Europe, Asia, and Africa. For whatever that's worth. I think it's worth a lot. Who was the Aztec ruler that was conquered by Cortez? Who? The question is, who was the Aztec ruler who was conquered by Cortez? Montezuma. Montezuma. Who is, this should be an easy one, and very relevant. Who is the founder of Islam? Mohammed. Mohammed. The place where Islam was founded. You can give a place. What? The name of the country, the name of the city. What place was Islam founded? Mecca, which is located in Arabia. Arabia, Mecca. The Arabs, the Islamic people have split over what big issue? Who's to lead them? Big issue, who's to lead? Muhammad never specified. Well, according to some he did specify, according to others he didn't. All right. What is the world's largest desert? Sahara. The Sahara. It once was a fertile place, folk. And the people living there had to abandon it. What religion is the chief religion among the civilized people of Southeast Asia? Places like Cambodia, Myanmar. Buddhism. Buddhism is still number one. Now, this is making news today. Nepal is of what religion, primarily? Primarily what? Islam, I believe. Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, those regions, Islam, and then India itself is Hindu. In other words, the wilder countries. Again, you can't imagine men galloping on horseback, waving their swords, fighting in the jungles of Vietnam. It doesn't work. Islamic people have fought excellently in the desert region with their cavalry, mounted cavalry galloping on horseback, frightening the enemy. They don't do well in regions of a lot of plant life, a lot of trees, a lot of bushes, and jungles. Yes. What's that?
What time is their final?
8:30.
8:30 in the
8:30 is about right here, same time, same place, 8:30 Wednesday morning. Again, I won't be here Monday, so but that doesn't mean you won't have. I mean, if you have an obligation Monday, don't tell your teacher. Mr. Cunningham said no, I didn't. I just said my class does not meet Monday. Don't tell your teacher that you don't. If you have a final exam Monday, you have to be there. That's another issue. But this class right here will not meet Monday. We'll be assembled right here at 8:30 on Wednesday, May the 6th. All right. When we talk about the Grand Canal is located in what country? It joined two rivers in that big country. What canal are we talking about? China. Joined the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Which dynasty was conquered by the Mongolians? The Song. So let's spell Song. Pronounced Sung, I believe. Something like that. Now, who led the Mongolians? Genghis Khan. Let's see. Who is the most famous Mongol ruler of China? Who built China up to the most prosperous time probably ever had, and is famous, remembered by Westerners because of a famous Westerner who visited China this time. His name is Kublai Khan. The Western man's name was Marco Polo. Marco Polo visited China and got to a high office in the court of Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan sent a navy rather to conquer Japan. The navy got destroyed. How? Kamikaze. Kamikaze came up. A strong wind came up. The primary religion of the Japanese? Shinto. All right. We use the word pariah. Where does that word come from? Pariah. They are the outcasts, the people of India who are outcasts, untouchables. And the word is sometimes used to describe undesirable people anywhere else in the world, or people who are not liked. Who was the first Holy Roman Emperor, the first Germanic king to be crowned by the Pope as Roman Emperor? Charlemagne. It was Christmas Day in the year 800. Charlemagne. Who was the first French king who converted to Christianity? King Clovis. All right. Throughout the Middle Ages, well, I'm going to quit. Europeans practiced a system of government called feudalism, but I'll quit there. Everybody have a great weekend, and hey, you do have quite a bit of time to prepare for your final, and you have a lot of material now to study from. Those 130 pages will narrow down to A lot less when you reduce the font size. It's still going to be more than you want to handle, though. All right.